I'm Bethany McLean.
Did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism and whether greed's a good idea?
And I'm Luigi Zingales.
We have socialism for the very rich, rugged individualism for the poor.
And this is Capitalisn't, a podcast about what is working in capitalism.
First of all, tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed?
And most importantly, what isn't?
We ought to do better by the people that get left behind. I don't think we should kill the capital system in the process.
As everyone knows, there is an election coming up soon. We thought it would be important to look at the economic proposals that the two candidates are putting forward through our unique lens. Which of their proposals are capital is and which one are capital isn't?
Of course, this is a challenging exercise in several respects. As a friend of mine said, both candidates are running on vibes more than specific proposals.
What makes this discussion particularly urgent and particularly interesting is that neither candidate is espousing a traditional Republican or Democratic point of view. Take tariffs. Before the Trump presidency, tariffs were pretty much a no-no for Republicans, I think since Herbert Hoover, and we're talking 90 years ago. Trump levied tariffs on thousands of products valued approximately $380 billion in 2018 and 19. And the Biden administration, rather than lifting those tariffs, has kept them in place. And in May 2024, announced new tariff hikes on additional $18 billion of Chinese goods, including semiconductors and electric vehicles.
Another example. The Republican Party used to be the party of fiscal responsibility. That got blown out of the water in the Trump administration. Some might say it got blown out of the water in the Bush administration, but it really got blown out of the water in the Trump administration, partly due to the pandemic, of course. But it does seem that for both Republicans and Democrats, budgets no longer matter.
Now, to be honest, I think that the Republican Party has not been the past party of fiscal responsibility since at least Ronald Reagan.
Yeah. But at least they pretended
That's
to care
true.
about it, Luigi. At least they pretended to care about it. Trump took it to a whole new level, and he doesn't even pretend to care.
And it is true that Bush father actually basically lost the election because he did care about fiscal responsibility and increased taxes. So I think there was a different element. But both candidates toss around sentences like opportunity economy, this is Harris, which sounds great, but what it is not exactly clear. Trump, on the other hand, said that the economy is terrible and the inflation is killing people and is the worst ever in America, which of course is not true. And his entire plan seems to rest on getting energy prices down. Moody's had a great quote saying that quantifying the macroeconomic impact of Trump policies is complicated by their lack of transparency and specificity, requiring us to make assumptions regarding their design and size.
So we want to try to get underneath the talking points as best we can and hear what the two candidates are actually saying and what it might mean. But Luigi, before we get to that I have a couple of questions for you. So one is that the economy always gets blamed on or credited to the president. Some of the issues we're going to talk about are really big issues. But in terms of the well-being of ordinary Americans and the direction of the stock market, two different things, of course, how much do presidential policies matter? Is the economy a separate beast from the president, or is it inextricably linked to the president?
I think neither. In a sense, we cannot blame or praise the president for every little bleep in GDP. And certainly we cannot blame them for something like COVID. But I think that in the long term, policies do matter. We have discussed many times in our podcast the impact that the entry of China in the WTO had on the well-being of Americans in general, but particularly the big Midwest. That was a policy choice, was not inevitable, and now we can argue that this was done in the best of assumptions to try to bring China into the realm of democracies in the world. So I'm not necessarily saying that it was a bad decision, but it is a decision with enormous consequences.
That's interesting. I was thinking when you were talking about the famous quote from Benjamin Graham, who of course is Warren Buffett's mentor, and he says about the market, in the short run, the market is a voting machine, but in the long run, it's a weighing machine. And I was thinking that about, there's got to be some kind of analogy there with policy choices that in the short run, it may swing wildly around and it doesn't seem to matter that much, but in the long run, perhaps they matter very much indeed. Anyway, a second question for you that's that's important given that Trump says all the time how terrible the economy is. Harris obviously can't say that and doesn't seem to think it. Where do you think we are now?
I think it depends very much your perspective. If you are living in one of the two coasts and you are a boomer, you own a house and a 401k, I think life is pretty good. If you live in the middle of the country or you're young and you don't own a house or your salary has not kept up with inflation in the last 4 years, you're pretty angry. I was listening to a podcast the other day looking at the pivotal states, including Pennsylvania. They had these very interesting statistics that if you look at counties where the per capita income was below the one in 2019, there are only 20% of the counties in the United States, but 40% in Pennsylvania.
Wow. That's a really interesting observation, and we'll get to the Federal Reserve as part of our discussion and Fed policy, but it certainly has seemed in recent decades that everything the Fed does either benefits upper income Americans or doesn't hurt them, whereas the brutal impact of things like higher interest rates, which we can debate how much that's the Fed, but that affect lower income Americans who also don't stand to benefit from the stock market soaring. And so I guess all of this does come back to how unequal our society is in some ways. So where do you think we should get started, Luigi?
My inclination would be to start where most of the interest is in this moment, which is, number one, inflation or living standards of the median American. I see in Harris two main proposals. The introduction of some form of limitation against price gouging that already exists in many states, and it's really for extreme situations. So I don't see how this will do much of an impact. She talks also about capping the price of more drugs. Already the Biden administration has capped the price of insulin, I think for only Medicare people, and then trying to expand it. Price capping is a pretty sort of brutal form of price control that works up to a point. But the other aspect she's trying to push is on the issue of housing. Let's face it, more than 30% of many people's income is spent in housing. So the price of housing is a very important aspect. Not so much as it enters in the daily inflation, because the way in which it enters is not perfect. But in terms of people's perception that they can't make it, I think that that's a big issue. She has a proposal to actually subsidize first-time buyer with $25,000. And then she also has some form of child care subsidy. I don't think that her approach is very much to try to fight the price increases, is more to either sort of regulate prices, that's the insulin, or to subsidize demand to alleviate the pain.
It seems to me that her proposals to include more drugs on the list where we can't raise prices, including insulin, seems to me to make sense. But the proposals against price gouging on food and the idea that big companies are just greedy and that's why prices are high seems to me to be more flawed. So do you think I'm right in seeing drug prices and food prices in two separate categories, or would you lump them together? And then we can get to housing as its own issue.
What I'm showing my true colors here. What I think is lacking is a general view of, do we have a competition problem or not? Okay, so why drug prices are so high is in part because we don't have enough competition in some sectors, or do we have a cost problem? This is where Trump is closer to, I think, proposing a solution. It's not necessarily a solution I love, but he's going in the direction of say, let's deregulate. You know, there is a conservative website, so you might want to check to what extent this is correct or not, but that computes the amount of additional cost that is imposed by every regulation that is introduced. And this is not a number they make up, it's a number that by law, whoever proposed the regulation has to present for the Federal Registry of Regulation, something like that. They have to file in how many hours will take to do and how much does it cost, et cetera, et cetera. And so if you look at the last 3.5 years, and not even 4 years, of the Biden administration, you see that the additional cost of regulation is $1.7 trillion. If you look at the 4 years of the Trump administration, is $65 billion. Okay, so even the regulation does not mean that you reduce the cost. I'm not prepared to swear on these numbers. What I find it interesting is there is a gigantic gap. While I personally think that a lot of regulation is very useful, regulation does have a cost, and that cost somehow is transferred into prices. So if you are concerned about prices, I think what you want is reduce the amount of overburden regulation and increase competition. Those would be the two approaches. Either sort of by fiat regulating prices or subsidizing demand, I'm not so sure is the right strategy.
Yeah, I guess I put drugs in a different category because so many pharmaceuticals are affected by the decision by the U.S. government, one at the behest of Big Pharma, that the government couldn't negotiate on the prices it paid for drugs. And the Biden administration creating a list of drugs on which they would set the prices and which could be negotiated. I think it's different when you have a big buyer like the government, that's the cost of medicines in a slightly different category than the cost of food. Is that the right way to think about it?
Oh, absolutely. But then I will put in the question of competition.
Yeah.
I would say, look, it's not that we're trying to regulate prices. I think that the message is wrong. We're not trying to regulate prices. Is that we don't have competition. And when you lack competition, then you need to find an alternative pricing mechanism, which is not accepting whatever the pharmaceutical companies want to ask. And by the way, mechanism of reimportation of drugs that creates more competition will help reducing those prices tremendously. But then you do it more systematically. I think that the issue of ad hoc and announced just before the election is kind of a bit strange.
And housing is also, I think, in its own category, because isn't the issue here, at least as far as I can tell, I did a speaking tour with the federal home loan banks in the Midwest, and everywhere I went, all these small towns throughout the Midwest, the community bankers would say the biggest issue facing their community was the lack of supply of housing. It's the lack of supply of housing that is making it totally unaffordable. Isn't it a little bit perverse to be offering buyers $25,000? I mean, that helps, obviously, people buy a house, but it just pushes up the price, and it doesn't necessarily do anything about supply, per your point about a functioning market, right?
Absolutely. To the credit of the Harris proposal, does add some element on the supply side. So let's step back a second, because I think there are two potential bottlenecks here. The first one, which is dominant in the two coasts, is the so-called NIMBY movement, not in my backyard. Municipalities, supported by the current owners, don't want to make available, for example, multi-unit buildings that will increase the supply. The problem is an interesting problem from, if you want, a democratic point of view, because the federal government cannot intervene massively on what the localities do. However, there are a lot of ways you can do indirectly. So my favorite way would be to say, you can only deduct your property taxes if the municipalities is open to build new buildings. Now, this would be nice because it would be done through legislation, it would be transparent. You have more sneaky ways, which is I don't like, which is like saying Fannie and Freddie will only be authorized to make a loan to firms that do X, Y, and Z. Now, to be fair, the Biden administration has already entered into this realm because only housing with certain environmental properties qualify. But introducing this mega regulation through decree of a bureaucrat inside the administration is not my preferred thing. If I were the Harris or the Trump administration, I will propose a law and say, look, a little bit like the Highway Act that said, we do subsidy to federal highway only if they have a speed limit. This is for the two coasts, and I think this would be dramatic. If you are in the middle of the country, now there are some places like Las Vegas where federal land is a constraint. You know that most of the land outside of Las Vegas is owned by the federal government and is not available for development. If you were to make that available, of course, supply will increase, and that's what Trump wants to do. I don't know what towns you had in mind. If you go to the famous or infamous Springfield, Ohio, where you have a sudden influx of migrants and you see increased demand of housing, then the supply is not instantaneous. And there are some initiative to build more homes, and the Harris administration has some proposal to build more homes, could be the way to go. However, and we're going to talk later about immigration, you might argue that one method is also to limit immigration, at least temporarily, to first build the house and then let people come. If you let them come before you build the houses, then you have a problem.
I can see on a national level how that would appear to be true, i.e. more people coming into the country via immigration, demand for housing. That would mean fewer homes for the people who are already here. But given that housing is so local and that immigration tends to be pronounced in certain areas, is that actually what's happening?
I think so, in a sense. Do you remember our interview with Leah Bustan? She did say that immigration causes an increase in rent and in house prices. The report, the true report, not the fantasy from Spring Hill, Ohio, but do say that rent has gone up tremendously, and the locals are upset by that. And you can see, and it says, if you have an influx of new people, and in the short term, the supply of houses is pretty limited. Now, it can be only a temporary problem if the supply responds, but it is a problem nonetheless.
So do you think it's a problem that should be taken into account in the immigration debate?
Absolutely. Not in the direction necessarily saying we want less immigrant, but to realize that if you want immigrants, you need to find a way to actually increase the supply of housing, and that you do create an inconvenience for a bunch of people, which, by the way, tend to be at the lower end of the income distribution. Because if you're rich, first of all, you own your house, and your house prices go up, you are happy. If you don't own a house, you are the one who pay most of the cost.
I was also thinking about this quote from Moody's on immigration, which was really interesting, because the quote from Moody's said that while the surge in immigration has presented many challenges to communities, quote, the benefit has been to significantly increase labor supply and help ease wage and price pressures. This in turn has forestalled even more aggressive interest rate hikes by the Federal Reserve, and thus a possible recession. Reversing these immigration flows, as Trump is proposing, will quickly result in a tighter job market and foment wage and price pressures, with immigrant-heavy industries taking the greatest hit. And I thought that was interesting, particularly the part about easing wage pressures, because we've talked a lot about whether immigration affects wages at the lower end. And it does seem to me that the consensus is becoming now that it does.
It's interesting because I think the Moody's report is written from the point of view of a stock market owner.
Right.
And so you see fomenting wage increases. If you are on the other side of the divide, you're saying, welcome wage increases. It says, remember that most people didn't make it up for the increase in inflation. They're barely now making up for the increase in inflation. So fomenting wage increases is a bit of a loaded term.
Should we go to tariffs?
Yeah.
One of the things that fascinates me about the tariff argument, it does seem to me that the political class very quickly flipped, and now almost everyone in the political class is a believer in tariffs. When Trump first put tariffs in place, this was, crazy Donald Trump, but the Biden administration kept them, and no one's talking about getting rid of them. Trump is talking about being far more aggressive on tariffs than Harris is, but no one's talking about getting rid of them. So how is it that tariffs became acceptable in the political class? And are they acceptable among economists, or are tariffs still viewed as effectively a tax increase and basically a bad idea?
I think that the way we move is because people have seen tariffs at the very minimum as an instrument of industrial policy. And to be fair, they've always been considered an instrument of industrial policy. In a sense, from Alexander Hamilton, the idea of tariffs to protect the birth of the industry in the United States was absolutely a goal. They were becoming passé because the infancy industry argument clearly did not apply very much to the United States, at least for a long time. It was not in the interest of the United States to have other countries develop this argument. So I think that the universal consensus was low tariffs is better. The divide that I see between Harris and Trump is not whether to use tariff for industrial policy. In a sense, they might have different industrial policy in mind, but they both see this as an instrument of industrial policy. What Trump sees the tariff is an instrument of bargaining. When he says that he wants 10% tariffs to everybody, including our European allies or whatever, and 60% of China, there are two schools of thoughts. One is say he means what he says, and the other said actually it is simply the fact that he wants to have a threat to bargain with Europe or whatever. Unfortunately, this fundamental question is not really addressed. The fundamental question is that with the perspective of today, the WTO agreement has been a mistake. It's been a mistake. Why? Because we have not built in mechanisms to protect against dumping by other nations, most likely sort of China, but not only China. And so now it's a useless agreement because nobody wants to be in it except maybe China. And so I think that the future is an alternative WTO agreement with, at least among democracies. How do you reach this goal? I think the idea of doing bilateral agreements, like it was done with Mexico and Canada, and then extended maybe to England, maybe to the EU, and etc., and at the end include everybody but China, then you basically go to what you wanted to be at the beginning, to a WTO with more rules. And in this bilateral agreement, you can put more serious mechanisms to block instrument of dumping. This is the generous interpretation, if you want, of the mechanism. The negative interpretation is that he doesn't understand the impact tariffs have on prices. And it says, we're discussing just before about inflation, and the question is how much of that transfer into prices. And actually, I was reading last night in preparation for this a paper written by a colleague of mine and also the managing editor of the IMF and published in AER, so reliable paper, looking at the impact on prices of the tariffs that the Trump administration imposed, and also the retaliatory prices that China imposed on the United States. And what is interesting is actually the reaction of prices is asymmetric, at least of the wholesale prices is asymmetric, because there is very little evidence that China cuts down on prices to absorb part of the tariffs. It's only like 10%. The United States are forced to cut down much more, almost 50%, the level of the tariff. And the reason is very simple. It's because the United States export to China commodities like soy. And so if there is a tariff on American soy, but not Brazilian soy, the Chinese buys from the Brazilian. And so the price of American soy has to almost go down as much as the tariff in order to compete in the international market. It's different if you produce a differentiated good. Let's take the cars, okay? So China supplies some parts of the GM cars. If there is a tariff, it's not that GM goes and buys those parts from Brazil, because Brazil does not produce them, they're not produced to specification, blah, 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 etc., etc. So basically, GM is forced to spend more. Now, what is fascinating is that very little of this is translated in the short term, in 1 or 2 years, into consumer prices. So you will expect that they translate everything? No. In the short term, not much is translated into consumer prices. The authors don't know is whether companies sort of spread the cost of tariffs across tax products and non-tax products. So imagine that there are two types of shaving cream, one that is taxed and the other that is not. They increase the price a little bit of both. And so a study cannot identify the difference very clearly. But seems to me that they might have reduced their margins. They have solved some of this cost in their margins, which, by the way, ironically, is what the Harris administration is trying to do with price control, which is to try to reduce the margins of firms. Tariffs do that the other way around.
When you read everywhere, basically in any mainstream discussion of tariffs, the view is that increasing tariffs is basically a tax increase. I take it from what you're saying about this paper, it's not that simple at all.
No, it's not as simple at all. In the sense, it is true that if it's a homogeneous good and it's perfect competition, all the conditions that economists normally assume, but in the real life don't apply, then that statement is correct.
That's fascinating.
And that's the reason why I wanted to see a recent paper, an authoritative paper, and this paper said, look, when it comes to commodities, is almost true, not exactly true, but almost true. And that's what actually we export. And so for us, we absorb part of the cost of the tariffs that China imposes on U.S. agriculture. So that's a problem. When it comes to the products we import, it's true that prices at the source are not cut. So it is a tax increase for the wholesaler. But as you know, not all price increases to the wholesaler are instantaneously rebated to the level of prices. So if you see a change in in the exchange rate, for example, you don't have an instantaneous change in prices retail. Eventually, long term, again, we economists tend to say, in perfect competition, this is what happened. Yeah, but we're never in perfect competition. So what happens? I think the bottom line is there will be an increase in prices, absolutely. Will it be one-to-one? Absolutely not. Over what time period, God only knows.
That's fascinating. So does that leave you with capital is or capital isn't on the question of tariffs with either Trump's proposals or Harris's far tamer proposals?
I am an old-fashioned economist. I tend to be against tariffs in general. So I think overall it's not a good idea. However, if they are part of a meaningful industrial policy, could be a good idea, but they need to be paired with a lot of other things at the same time. It's not because we put a tax on Chinese toys that all of a sudden we're going to develop a toy industry. And by the way, I'm sorry for the kids, but if there is an industry that I don't consider strategic, is the toy industry.
Right. Or perhaps a better example would be it's not at all clear. In fact, it's not true that by putting a tax on Chinese semiconductors that we're going to suddenly redevelop semiconductor manufacturing capacity in this country, right?
No, but for example, in the EV, now we might want to discuss whether this is a good idea or a bad idea. But if you think that the United States can catch up or Europe can catch up to the production of EV by China, then putting a tax might be a good idea. But remember, there are some costs because if you put the tax on EV, you're making it more difficult for people to do the right thing, which is the transition to an electric vehicle and less pollution. So this is kind of you are in a pickle.
So in other words, our grand goal of deciding whether each of these proposals were a capital is or a capital isn't is really beautiful in theory, but gets really, really difficult when you get into the weeds on it, because what might be a bad idea in isolation might be a good idea as part of a larger picture.
Yeah, and I would like to add one thing. The Trump logic of bargaining all the time, I think, is not very strategic. So in business, he was smart enough to change partners all the time. So you always find a full deal in business with him. But when you are with nations, and especially with allies, you are in a repeated relationship. And so, yeah, you can threaten once, but you cannot threaten constantly and maintain the relationship. The risk is that we really unravel in a beggar your neighbor policy, which was one of the many causes of the Great Depression. Herbert Hoover, he was the one who introduced tariffs, and the outcome wasn't good.
One other thing I did want to touch on, which is that Trump's answer to a lot of things does appear to be based around more drilling and how that will lower energy prices. And that has struck me as somewhat foolish in the sense that both energy prices are set on a world, not natural gas. Natural gas is a local market. Oil prices are set on a global level. And so the ability for the U.S. to drill more and bring down oil prices is just not really how it works. And then secondly, or just as importantly, the ability of the U.S. to drill more is also predicated on the market and where prices are and whether the market is willing to finance drilling. Because a lot of American oil supply comes from fracking. That's the swing supply. And fracking isn't profitable unless oil prices are high. And you can't make publicly traded companies drill if they're going to lose money on their production. So this idea that we can simply drill more and that's going to reduce energy prices seems to me to be fraught for a whole bunch of reasons. Do you think I'm right about that, Luigi?
I think you know more about fracking than I do, so I trust your answer on fracking. I think in the last few years, we have seen U.S. companies benefiting tremendously from lower price of gas because, as you said, the market for gas is segmented. And, there is an issue about the impact of this on climate change. There is also an alternative that if some of the industries move to China, in China, energy is produced still with coal. So one can make a global climate change argument, say we should impose tariffs on China because of the carbon content and favor local industry, because if we produce in the United States with gas and we kill coal production in China, at the global level, the world is better off.
Aubrey McClendon, who was one of the pioneers of natural gas fracking, made lots of arguments, and it was obviously in his pocketbook interest, but to transition to a natural gas economy. And I know natural gas is complicated among environmentalists, but it's better than oil. And certainly if you're arguing for energy independence or American control over prices, you would be in favor of transitioning to natural gas wherever possible.
But my understanding, this is worth a separate episode, my understanding is at this point, solar and wind are so cheap. It's really a pity not to try to take advantage of those more. So I think that there are some bottlenecks in the process, but even Texas is going solar big time.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think Texas has a shockingly high percentage of its energy being produced by alternative energy sources, which is not what you would think of when you think Texas. If you're enjoying the discussions we're having on this show, then there's another University of Chicago Podcast Network show you should check out. It's called the Chicago Booth Review Podcast. What's the best way to deliver negative feedback? How can you use AI to improve your business strategy? And why is achieving a soft landing so very hard? The Chicago Booth Review Podcast addresses the big questions in business, policy, and markets with insights from the world's leading academic researchers. It's groundbreaking research delivered in a clear and straightforward way. Find the Chicago Booth Review Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. As a journalist myself, I can tell you how important it is for reporters, especially business reporters, to develop a deeper understanding of the subjects we're covering. The Stigler Center's Journalist in Residence program offers paid training in the fundamentals of economic and business at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. And there are other perks. Learn more and apply now at chicagobooth.edu/StiglerJIR. Okay, so I know you don't want to talk about taxes. We all agree taxes are really boring, but it is also one of the great differentiations between Harris and Trump. And it may be a differentiation that doesn't matter because perhaps neither one will be able to pass their plans. But I think the two things that stand out to me most about Harris's proposal, and I think, by the way, the child tax credit is interesting and great, but J.D. Vance has proposed the same things. They don't so much differ on some of these details. But Harris definitely believes in a billionaire tax, and she believes in raising corporate taxes. And do you have a view on either of those issues?
One can have a view on two grounds, one from an overall fiscal point of view, and the other on a point of view of equality as a measure of fairness. From a fiscal point of view, I think we are in a, may I say, freaking disaster. In a sense, the level of deficit of the current administration, which is the Biden administration, is really very elevated, given that we are still in an expansion. So we're not in the middle of a recession. We're not in the middle of a COVID crisis. We still run an unsustainable deficit at the level of debt to GDP that has become dramatically high, and with future prospect in terms of growth of population that are pretty slim. I feel like I'm living the same nightmare twice, because when I was like a kid, this was the status of Italy in the early 80s. The result has been abysmal because Italy, I don't know that it necessarily is cause and effect, but Italy from the mid-90s to today has stopped growing completely in level of GDP per capita. So I think that is a nightmare for me. So I am more a fiscal hawk. Now, of course, I don't want crazy taxes, but I think a slight increase in corporate taxes, I think, is a great idea. One aspect that it seems to me the Harris proposal is trying to target is the fact that there is an enormous amount of capital gains that are not taxed because they are transferred through inheritance. So there is a loophole that if either you donate or you transfer through inheritance an appreciated stock, nobody pays the capital gain on that appreciated stock. I think that that's a loophole that needs to be closed. Certainly to be closed, especially for enormous amount of wealth. So imposing it for people with above $100 million, it seems that is really a drop in the bucket in terms of reduces inequality, but a drop in the right direction.
Yeah, perhaps our whole podcast should just boil down to whether or not the national debt and the budget matters, because that for sure is the one thing that neither candidate is talking about, which is how they're actually going to pay for their proposals, much less reduce our stupendous debt. And whether or not it even matters, we've moved to a MMT economy without anybody even officially embracing MMT. Most economists, or at least many, having thought that it doesn't really work, but it's actually pretty insane. And I was thinking about this also as we discussed earlier about inflation and interest rates, because if we don't get our debt under control, then in the end, even the Fed starts to lose whatever control over interest rates it actually has, right? Everybody is ignoring the proverbial elephant in the room, which is our national debt, and the fact that if we don't get that under control, that is going to sharply limit our options in the future.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. But I think there is a conspiracy not to talk about this during election.
Right? But isn't that a problem? I mean, if in the end, everything else could be perfect and great, but the national debt continues to explode, it's not going to be perfect and great for very long, right? We're losing control over our future. So in the end, by not talking about it, we're all just dancing around the issue that really matters.
I completely agree. So one thing but this is more an interesting nugget, is the position on cryptos. You know, Donald Trump recently has come out big time in favor of crypto, against any form of central bank digital currency, which means the ability of the central bank to issue a digital currency that we can use. And it says today we have only physical currency that individual can use, the paper dollars. There is no strong reason why we shouldn't have a form of digital currency that paper can use in the same way in which we use the paper dollar, for reasons that are not completely clear to me, but even Vivek Ramaswamy was completely against this from the beginning of his campaign. Trump now has embraced this idea, and his embrace crypto wants to make the United States the capital of cryptos.
Isn't he just positioning himself among his base and trying to win over a crowd of people who might be independent voters, particularly in Florida, by saying this? Because he was once anti-crypto and now he's pro-crypto. And what does it even mean to be pro-crypto? I view all of this as an election game rather than as anything real or any evidence of a real policy. But maybe I'm too cynical.
No, I think you're not cynical enough, because I think that this stuff will have consequences. Because first of all, Harris is more moderately, but trying to chase him a bit. Part of this explosion of the crypto people is because the SEC has been pretty aggressive in trying to regulate crypto. Last time I checked, I think even Harris was trying to take distance from the position against the SEC. Nobody wants to touch it, also because they donate a lot of money. Because we know now that in the midterm election, Sam Bankman-Fried donated a lot of money to both parties. If history is any guidance, they're still doing that on both sides. And so the other thing that I would like to discuss, because is the lack of thereof that really is painful for me, is the lack of a real push for more competition policy. If you are concerned about high prices, it says, I have a paper with Mara Thatcher showing that in the United States, people pay a much higher cost of cell phone. Why? Because there are only 3 providers. You go to Europe and cell phone works as well as here. You go to Germany, you go to Denmark, and cost a fraction of what it costs today here. So that's a tax to consumers that is redistributed to basically shareholders and managers of Verizon and AT&T. You can apply this logic in many places. It would be natural to have a merge of an aggressive competition policy to keep prices lower or even reduce prices in some cases, like the cell phone industry would be a case. And this could be applied to cell phone, housing, even energy, all the stuff above. And the fact that in spite of the demand by consumers, because there is no doubt that voters are concerned about high prices, in spite of this demand, we see no supply. Why we see no supply? The cynical part of me is say because the people benefit from these high prices are the one who finance both parties.
Yeah. Oh, I think you're right. I think where I'm getting on this whole discussion is that what we're lacking is a grand unified theory, that all these things bleed into other things. And it's easy to pull on one little piece of it, like tariffs, or one little piece of it, like inflation and price controls. But if you just pull on that one little piece of it, you don't actually look at the larger quilt, the larger fabric that you're either unraveling or knitting, then it really just doesn't make any sense at all. And neither candidate has a sense of any kind of grand unified theory, or doesn't want to take it on, or they view it as too complicated for the American public, so they're not talking about it. I'm not sure which is better, but I think that lack of a coherent framework is definitely a capitalism, at least in my view.
And what is very humbling for a person who spent the last 30 years of his life teaching economics is that this is the first presidential race where both candidates have an undergraduate degree in economics. Ain't good.
I had totally forgotten that. Oh my God. That just proves it, Luigi. Down with economists. Down with economists.
I don't think we have done a good job, I have to say.
Capitalisn't is a podcast from the University of Chicago Podcast Network and the Stiegler Center in collaboration with the Chicago Booth Review. Also check out promarket.org, a publication of the Stiegler Center. The show is produced by me, Matt Hodap, and Leah Cesarine, with production assistance from Utsav Gandhi, Sebastian Burka, and Brooke Fox.